Imagine walking through a busy street, not knowing that just around the corner, something horrifying is unfolding. A black girl, barely 17, is being shoved and dragged by two officers, their faces twisted in disgust. It's a scene that shouldn't be happening in 2025, but it is. The girl, overwhelmed and confused, tries to fight back. But before she can even process what's happening, the officers throw her into a nearby fountain. Cold water splashes over her, soaking her clothes and dignity in one brutal move. But this isn't where the story ends. Unbeknownst to the officers, someone powerful is watching from a distance. Someone who isn't just a passive bystander, but someone who can turn the tide. As the girl splashes in the water, humiliated and gasping for breath, the powerful passerby has seen it all: the injustice, the cruelty, the moment when everything could change. But will they step in? Will they take action and expose the truth, or will they stay silent, leaving the girl to face the consequences alone? What happens next will make you question the very fabric of our justice system. Who is the mysterious figure watching? What will they do in the face of such blatant racism? And most importantly, how will this one moment shape the lives of everyone involved? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into a story that challenges everything we think we know about power, privilege, and the fight for justice. Trust me, this is one story you won't want to miss. The scene in the fountain wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of something much larger. In this city, where racial tensions had been simmering for years, this wasn't the first time a black person had been mistreated by those sworn to protect and serve. The officers involved were no strangers to controversy, having been at the center of other incidents that never quite made it to the public eye. Their arrogance, their belief that they could act without consequence, had only grown over time. The girl, whose name was Maya, had always been taught to keep her head down, avoid trouble, and be cautious when dealing with authority. Her parents, both activists, had tried to prepare her for a world that often saw people like her as lesser. But no matter how many times they warned her, nothing could truly prepare her for the harsh reality of what happened that day. Maya had been walking home from a friend's house, no different than any other day. She didn't know the officers were looking for anyone, to take out their frustrations on. But she had no way of knowing that her path would cross theirs in a split second, triggering something in them that would ultimately leave her soaking wet and humiliated in front of a crowd of strangers. As the officers stood by the fountain, watching Maya struggle to regain her composure, something changed. That's when the figure stepped forward. But who was this person? What was their connection to the officers, if any? And more importantly, why did they feel compelled to intervene now, at this precise moment? With every passing second, the stakes grew higher, and the pressure mounted. The situation was quickly escalating, but Maya had no idea just how much her life was about to change. Would this bystander truly step in, or would it be another injustice left unchallenged? The tension was palpable, and the clock was ticking. Maya's heart was racing as she pulled herself out of the cold water, her body shaking with a mix of shock and anger. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The officers stood there, their eyes cold, as if they didn't care about the mess they'd just caused. Their laughter was quiet but sharp, and they exchanged a look of satisfaction, as if they'd just won some twisted victory. The crowd around them had begun to murmur, but no one dared to step forward. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the weight of the situation settled in. No one was going to help her. But that's when she noticed the figure in the distance, standing just beyond the crowd, a tall person in a dark coat, seemingly out of place yet completely composed. Maya didn't know who they were, but something about their stance told her they weren't just another bystander. They were watching everything, carefully, intently. The thought lingered in her mind, but the officer's mocking words pulled her back to the harsh reality. Meanwhile, across the street, a woman named Carla stood watching the scene unfold from her car. She had just parked and was about to head inside to her apartment when she saw the commotion near the fountain. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel as she recognized the officers. They weren't just random cops. They were part of a crew that had been known for targeting black people, harassing them without cause. Carla had witnessed their actions before in the same neighborhood, but she'd never seen someone brave enough to confront them. It felt like the city was holding its breath, as if it were waiting for someone to step in. Her phone buzzed. A message from her friend flashed on the screen. "Did you see what happened at the fountain?" Carla's heart dropped. She couldn't just sit there anymore. Something had to be done. But before she could react, she saw a car pulling up, its headlights flashing on the crowd. The figure from before was now moving toward the officers. Maya's eyes widened, but she was too far away to see clearly. Who was this person? Were they finally going to do something? Or was this just another moment, slipping away into silence? The tension grew thick in the air. Every second felt like an eternity. Maya's eyes flicked between the officers and the mysterious figure, her mind racing with confusion and disbelief. The water that clung to her skin felt like a constant reminder of her humiliation, but something in her gut told her she wasn't alone anymore. The figure was moving toward the officers now, their steps steady but purposeful. Maya couldn't tell if this person was a threat or a savior. Every instinct in her told her to stay put, not to make a scene, but her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the heat of something changing in the air. The officers' conversation had turned from mockery to annoyance. They didn't like the attention they were getting from the gathering crowd, who had started to pull out their phones. One officer, Officer Davis, the one who had pushed her into the fountain, glared around, clearly frustrated. He began to approach the bystander, his chest puffed out as if trying to intimidate them into backing off. His voice, low but sharp, cut through the murmurs in the crowd. "You got a problem?" he demanded, his hand resting on his baton. The figure didn't flinch. There was something about their presence that made it clear they weren't intimidated, but the tension between them was palpable. Maya, still soaked and shivering, could hardly breathe. Her eyes darted from the figure to the officers and back again, waiting for something to happen. The crowd around them had fallen quiet, sensing the shift in energy. It felt like everything was about to boil over. Meanwhile, Carla, still in her car across the street, was watching the scene unfold with growing urgency. She could see the bystander now, standing tall in front of Officer Davis, not backing down an inch. Carla knew this was the moment someone finally had to take a stand. But her hands were trembling, her instincts pulling her in two different directions. She couldn't be just a witness. She had to do something. But what? Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the screen. It was a message from her friend again. "This is the chance. Don't let it pass." The seconds dragged on. The silence in the crowd was deafening, the tension unbearable. Officer Davis' eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer to the figure. The bystander finally spoke, their voice calm but full of authority. "What you're doing here is wrong, and you know it," they said, words hanging in the air like a challenge. Maya held her breath, praying that whatever happened next would be enough to change everything. The bystander's words hung in the air like a challenge, but the officers didn't flinch. Officer Davis' lips curled into a tight smirk. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice thick with disdain. "This is none of your business. Stay out of it." His hand tightened around his baton, a clear threat now. But just as the bystander seemed ready to respond, a sharp shout pierced the stillness. "Hey!" It was a voice Maya hadn't heard before, but it was loud, desperate. She turned, heart racing, and saw a young man sprinting toward the scene. He was disheveled, sweating, clearly out of breath, but he moved with a purpose. "You don't know who you're messing with," he shouted at Officer Davis. The officers, momentarily distracted, turned toward him. "What's your problem?" Davis growled, his eyes narrowing as the newcomer stepped forward. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the young man now. He was a local from her neighborhood, someone she'd seen around but never spoken to. His name was Marcus. He was a few years older than her, and his reputation was as someone who had always stood up against injustice, even when it meant facing off with the police. The bystanders shifted their weight, eyes flicking between Marcus and the officers. Maya could see their stance tighten. Something about the way the figure carried themselves suggested they had anticipated this moment. But then the unthinkable happened. Without warning, one of the officers, a different one who had been standing by quietly until now, pulled out a taser and pointed it straight at Marcus. "Stay back, or I'll zap you," he warned, his voice dangerously calm. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how this situation had spiraled so quickly, but the stakes had just gotten a lot higher. Marcus, despite the clear threat, didn't retreat. He raised his hands, but not in surrender, in defiance. "You'll have to shoot me first," he spat. The figure watching from the edge of the crowd seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, their expression unreadable. Were they going to intervene now? What would they do? Maya was frozen, every muscle tense, praying this wouldn't escalate into something even worse. The crowd had gone eerily silent, holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move. And then, just when it seemed like the standoff couldn't get any more intense, a siren wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Was it backup for the officers, or was help finally on the way? Everything hung in the balance. The siren grew louder, but it wasn't a normal police siren. It was different, more urgent. It came from a black SUV that screeched to a stop just behind the crowd. The officers froze for a second, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected interruption. The door swung open, and out stepped a woman in a sharp suit, her heels clicking against the pavement with a determined rhythm. Her presence was commanding, and her eyes scanned the situation like a hawk. Maya felt her pulse race as the woman made her way toward the officers, ignoring the stunned onlookers. She was tall, with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. There was something strangely familiar about her, but Maya couldn't place it. As the woman approached Officer Davis, the tension in the air grew thicker. "Is this how you handle things now?" the woman asked, her voice calm, but with an underlying fury. Officer Davis tried to compose himself, his face hardening. "Who are you supposed to be?" he muttered, clearly not recognizing her. The woman didn't respond directly. Instead, she pulled out a badge, one that gleamed in the sunlight. "I'm the person who makes sure you're accountable for every action you take. And right now, you've crossed the line." Maya's heart stopped. This wasn't just any bystander. This was someone powerful, someone who had the authority to take down corrupt officers. She watched as the woman's sharp eyes flicked over to Marcus, then to the bystander who had been standing so stoically through the chaos. For a split second, Maya could have sworn she saw recognition pass between them. Without missing a beat, the woman turned back to Officer Davis, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "You're under investigation for excessive force, and I'll be making sure the world knows what happened here today. Don't even think about moving." For a moment, the officers were paralyzed, unsure of how to respond. The bystander stepped forward now, their face finally visible, revealing a calm but resolute expression. It was a man, younger than Maya had expected, with piercing eyes that seemed to carry the weight of knowing too much. "You'll be hearing from us," he said to Davis, his voice cold. Just as the officers began to process what was happening, the woman raised her hand, signaling for the nearby crowd to pull out their phones. "You'll want to record this," she said, and the crowd, finally emboldened, immediately began filming. The officers were being exposed. They had no choice but to stand there, humiliated and helpless. Maya could hardly believe what was happening. The tension that had been building for so long finally reached its peak, but the resolution wasn't without its own twist. As the woman and the mysterious man continued to stand their ground, an unexpected figure appeared from the crowd, a familiar face that Maya never expected to see. It was her father. He had been on the phone the entire time, working behind the scenes. He had connections, people in high places, and they had been tracking the situation from the beginning. The woman in the suit, the one who had stepped in, was part of an investigative team his contacts had put together to expose police corruption. But it was her father who had given them the final push to make sure the officers were held accountable. As the officers were cuffed and led away by new officers who arrived on scene, Maya's mind raced. She was still in shock, not fully understanding how everything had unfolded. But what she knew for certain was that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It was just the first victory in what would surely be a much bigger battle. The sirens faded. The weight of the moment stayed with her. Maya had witnessed firsthand how power, courage, and unity could create change. But she also knew the road ahead was still uncertain. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Maya turned to look at the mysterious man one last time. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a small but knowing smile on his face. He didn't need to say anything. She understood. They weren't done yet. The fight for justice was just beginning. As the officers were driven away, Maya stood there, still in disbelief. Her mind was trying to catch up with everything that had just happened. She had gone from being humiliated in front of a crowd to witnessing the very people who were supposed to protect her held accountable for their actions. But the deeper realization struck her. This wasn't just a one-time victory. This was part of something much bigger. Her father approached her, his face a mixture of relief and pride. He pulled her into a hug, the weight of everything he had been through over the years now evident in his embrace. "I'm so proud of you, Maya," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She could feel the years of struggle and sacrifice in his words, and for the first time, she felt like she truly understood what he had been fighting for. The mysterious woman in the suit, whose name turned out to be Olivia, stayed behind to make sure the officers' arrests went smoothly. She spoke briefly with Maya's father, confirming that this was just the beginning of an ongoing investigation into corrupt police practices. "We'll need your help," Olivia said, turning to Maya's father. "But with this, we've opened a door. It's up to us to walk through it." Maya watched as the figure who had stood by her during the confrontation, Marcus, disappeared into the crowd. She hadn't had a chance to thank him, but somehow she knew that his involvement in this story wasn't finished either. Later that evening, as Maya sat in her room, reflecting on the events of the day, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "The fight's not over, Maya, but today we made a difference." She smiled softly, feeling the weight of the words. It wasn't just about one moment of justice. It was about a movement that had been ignited. And as the city began to heal, one thing was clear: change was coming, one step at a time.